Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for January 31st, 2020. Yesterday, the Imperial House of Representatives passed two measures in an attempt to limit the president's ability to wage war on Iran. But there are serious issues with both of them and with the administration's official stance. I'm going to cover all that in this episode. But first of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. You can find all of our archives, all of our platforms, whether it's video or audio-only podcast edition, show notes, ways to follow us, ways to support us, like our membership program, which is as little as $2 a month. We make it go a long, long way. Find all that information over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some time with me today. I think this is an incredibly important issue, but I promise to not take up too much of your time since it's Fast Friday, and hopefully I can get this done in about 10 to 15 minutes. Now, to start out, I want to set the stage. Here are, I guess this is a very common, basically a three-point narrative of what people believe are war powers under the Constitution. One, basically in almost every situation outside of a physical invasion of another country by U.S. military forces, we're talking things like limited airstrikes, drone warfare, or providing military, financial, or logistic assistance to another country to wage their war on another country as well, that the president in all those other situations doesn't need congressional approval. Two, in many other situations, the president has an almost unlimited unilateral total power to use the military power of the country against another country as long as it's just like 60 days or less. He's got a 60-day get-out-of-jail-free card. And then three, when Congress is required, we basically eliminate almost all potential military conflicts in modern times, but in those few situations where Congress is required, they can pass a kind of a broad general authorization for the use of military force, they call them AUMF, that allows the president to decide if, where, when, and against whom that military force is going to be used. Now, setting aside the fact that under the Constitution, nothing, absolutely nothing about these three points is true. There have been some very interesting developments this week, specifically regarding war powers, Iraq and Iran. There are two measures that passed, as I said right at the beginning, the House of Representatives yesterday. And here from CNBC, the first one of the measures would block funding for any use of offensive military force in or against Iran without congressional approval. It passed 228 to 175, mostly along partisan lines. I think there were 4 Republicans-ish that joined in and voted yes. And using the power of the purse is very important. But I'm not going to specifically talk about that in this episode. I do want to point out that even though I haven't reviewed that particular measure very closely, I did watch an episode of the Liberty Report yesterday and Ron Paul, and I'm going to include the links to all these, so I'll include the link to the Ron Paul Liberty Report as well. But Ron and Daniel McAdams said that the language, especially in the whereas clauses, was so bad that it might be a good idea to oppose it. I couldn't actually figure out if they were on board or not. I think they liked the idea of using the power of the purse, but the language was so bad that in essence, it could set the stage for seeing almost everything as being defensive rather than offensive against Iran and really not really making any change. So I urge you to actually watch that episode. I think it was like 20 minutes. I will link to that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now, the second that was passed was another amendment. It may have been to the same piece of legislation, but basically an amendment to a bill from Congresswoman Barbara Lee. And this would actually repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force. And here from her press release on it, she said, Congress took a historic step today to stop our endless wars. The House just passed my amendment to repeal the outdated 2002 Iraq authorization for the use of military force. That's the AUMF, 17 years after it was first passed. I mean, didn't realize we were still at war with Iraq, but I guess that's what they're claiming. But here, the House at least passed a repeal of that. She goes on further. She says Congress has the constitutional duty to declare war and authorize the use of force. And part of that is the responsibility to remove this unnecessary and outdated authorization. Now, of course, the administration is totally against this. They issued, this is according to The Hill, they issued veto threats that called the measures misguided. The administration argued that repealing the 2002 AUMF, quote, would embolden our enemies. I like the use of the word embolden. Couldn't resist that. But going further, that blocking funding for military action would hinder the president's ability to protect U.S. diplomats, forces, and interests in the region from the continued threat posed by Iran and its proxies. Now, this ended up passing by a little wider margin. It was 236 to 166. So it was amended on the bill, and then the bill passed the House yesterday sometime mid-afternoon. There were 11 Republicans that joined in to vote yes. It was mostly a partisan vote. It looks like we've got Matt Gaetz in Florida, Warren Davidson in Ohio, Thomas Massie, plus Andy Biggs in Arizona, Michael Cloud in Texas, Mike Gallagher in Wisconsin, Alex Mooney in West Virginia, Jaime Herrera Butler in Washington, Chip Roy in Texas, David Schweikert in Arizona, and Fred Upton in Michigan. I apologize if I get any of those names wrong. I don't know who almost any of these people are because I don't pay attention to Congress that closely. They're mostly just criminals, but these people voted to repeal the 2002 AUMF. I think that's actually a very good thing. But let's take a look at what the administration, this is official administration policy that was released by the White House or the Executive Office of the President, Office of Management and Budget on January 27th. So just 4 days ago. What was that, Tuesday? Statement of Administration Policy. Now, they're talking about H.R. 2456 from Congresswoman Lee, but this ended up being an amendment to this other bill. It's basically the same thing. The administration strongly opposes passage, which would repeal the authorization for use of military force against Iraq resolution of 2002. They go on. The 2002 AUMF provides specific statutory authorization to engage in military action to defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq. The 2002 AUMF has long been understood to authorize the use of force for, among other purposes, addressing threats emanating from Iraq, including threats such as ISIS, a group whose objectives have included establishing an Islamic State and using that state to support terrorism against the United States, as well as threats directed by Iran. Now, I'm not going to get into the problems with the 2002 AUMF. I did cover this in an episode about the recent battle that was going on between the U.S. government and the Iranian government back on January 6th, refuting lies, Iran, war, and the Constitution. In that episode, I specifically cover the problems with the 2002 AUMF, or basically any of these modern AUMFs, which really the short version is instead of Congress declaring war, what they're doing is they're passing the buck and giving that power to the executive branch to make that decision. So you can actually hear a little bit more about that in that particular episode. And in the show notes for it, I've got the links to the 2001, the 2002 AUMF, and you can read them for yourself. But let's just throw it out there and say I'm full of crap. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm totally wrong. And, you know, what is being said here by the administration is absolutely correct. The AUMF under the Constitution does authorize all of this. Well, what passed in the House yesterday, I'm not sure where it's at in the Senate because I wasn't paying attention this morning, but if it's gone further in the Senate, someone maybe can let me know in the chat or in the comments later on, but I will check on that later. But at least as of yesterday, the House is saying, okay, we passed this, or this body passed this back in 2002. And today, this body is saying, we're done. It's over. So that's the question. That's the question. What is the situation? Who gets to make that decision? Once war has been started or once force has been authorized, who makes the decision of when it ends? Now, first of all, we know, for example, from this 1805 message from Thomas Jefferson to Congress, here's what he said. Congress alone is constitutionally invested with the power of changing our condition from peace to war. So we know, anyone watching this or listening to me, we should be well versed in the fact that it's not just Thomas Jefferson. There is really no founder that ever said that it was anyone other than Congress that had the authority to change the condition from peace to war. Now, if someone attacks, then they're making that decision. It still isn't the executive branch's decision. The president never gets to make that decision. Madison famously said that the executive branch does not get to make that decision in any case. There is no situation where the executive branch gets to make that decision. But what about the other way around? Who gets to make the decision when it's over? Let's look at what James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, had to say in 1793. Here he's writing in a series of letters where his pen name was Helvidius. And this is how Madison put it. Those who are to conduct a war, and he put some emphasis on this. If you can see the text, it's a little smaller. Maybe I can make it larger here on the screen. Those who are to conduct a war, and he said conduct a war is emphasized, cannot in the nature of things be proper or safe judges whether a war ought to be commenced, continued, or concluded. Again, those who are conducting the war, the person who has the power to wage the war, that is under the Constitution, the president, are not the proper or safe judge of whether a war ought to be commenced, continued, or concluded. So even if there isn't a state of peace, it's not up to the president to make that decision. Even if a conflict is still going on, if you're going to continue it, according to James Madison, that is, then Congress is the one who makes that decision. It's not the executive branch. Or when is it going to end? It's not the president going back to Congress and saying, okay, my job is done here. Now, maybe they will let him do that, but under the Constitution, according to James Madison, whose word I will take on this over anyone alive today, Madison is saying the executive branch doesn't even get to make the decision whether or not the war is going to be over. He goes further. He says, they are barred. Now, mind you, the person who is conducting a war is barred, and that's the president, from the latter. I'll start it over. They are barred from the latter functions by a great principle in free government, analogous to that which separates the sword from the purse, or the power of executing from the power of enacting laws. The executive branch, the president, is 100% under the Constitution, 1,000%, whatever percent number you want to use, barred from using a veto power over Congress, saying that an authorization to use military force or a war or a conflict with another country is over. This is solely Congress's choice. So the problem really with what was passed, this amendment that was passed by the House, is that they're amending it onto another bill that has to go to the executive for a signature or a veto. So they're basically passing the buck. They're basically violating the Constitution by saying, well, the president has the final say. And if it's up to Nancy Pelosi or whoever decided to make this only get there as an amendment rather than a standalone resolution, with the executive branch or with the president being able to make a determination at the end, that is a terrible strategy. So Congress shouldn't be trying to end a war authorization or a military force authorization or an AUMF or anything when they're saying there is going to be an end to whatever conflict that we're in. They should never be amending that onto anything that goes to the president's desk other than as an order to tell him to stop. They're basically saying the president should have the final say. But under the Constitution, if we're going to side with James Madison, and I absolutely do, the executive branch has no say in this whatsoever. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you learned something. It is a very straightforward thing in my mind, but I think it's incredibly important. It's something that is missed in almost all the commentary on this, even from people that I would consider friends to liberty. I don't know, I've got nothing more than that. I'm going to put all the links to this in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you have a nice weekend planned. If you like what we're doing here, please smash that like button, hit subscribe, leave us a review on iTunes or whatever platform that you're on. And if you really, really, really want to be on board, I would be very grateful for any financial support you can give us. Our membership program goes for as little as $2 a month. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, thank you for joining me today. I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.